Okay, hi. So yeah, I'm Joy Brooke Fairfield. I live in Memphis, Tennessee. I teach media studies and some medium making and some gender and sexuality studies at a very small liberal arts college that needs me to teach everything. So I teach many things. I'm originally from Northern California, and my background, ever since I was in about high school, I've had a background in consent activism, queer activism, sex positive, and sex radical art practice. I'm trained as a performer and a director and a dramaturg, a little bit of production designing. And then I'm also trained as and train people in intimacy choreography and coordination, which I'm going to be talking about today. So firstly, can people in the room just raise your hand if you have heard of intimacy choreography and coordination? Cool. Okay, so just a little bit of sort of orientation. I have very few slides, so just, soak up what you can. And folks at home, I'm sorry that you're just staring at my title slide. But great. So intimacy, choreography, and coordination is a new field that's been coalescing in the theater, film, and media sort of fields, industries over the past decade or so. There's several different naming conventions. A lot of them run alongside previously established terms. So intimacy choreography just sort of means the staging and choreography of scenes of intimate pleasure, intimate violence, and also just nudity as it functions on stage and screen. Intimacy coordination is more associated with film, and it goes along with stunt coordination. And then intimacy direction is usually with theater, and that sort of goes in the naming convention of fight direction and fight choreography. Intimacy director is a term, so this was kind of a big news in theater intimacy direction because a piece on Broadway just won a Tony that had an intimacy director. Great, I'm just trying so hard to go slow. I normally talk twice as fast as this, but so people are getting more recognition for this. And in 2018, HBO began requiring trained and now licensed intimacy coordinators to work on any HBO show that has any kind of nudity or sexual exchange. So it's really kind of expanded very, very quickly in really the past sort of 3 to 4 years. And a lot of that has to do with the Me Too movement. The work itself did not come out of that. It had been already in development. But the sort of greater attention paid to sexual misconduct in the entertainment fields, I think, increased the amount of interest and uptake that's been happening. So my joke is, that something is starting to be popular when there's a Saturday Night Live episode about it. And there's a pretty funny, actually, it's still funny to us, so they did a pretty good job, SNL episode with that handsome Regé-Jean Page from Bridgerton. If you Google his SNL, there's a very funny episode where the actual intimacy choreographer gets sick and can't come. So they have these two terrible ones sort of, doing everything wrong. Basically it's a framework for approaching sex on stage and screen from a deeply consent-based perspective, which is simple, and it's also incredibly complex because, as I hope all of us know at this point, we don't live in a world that respects consent in any kind of systematic basis. So trying to sort of create a field with that as your sort of fundamental principle has a lot of challenges. In all my work, I try to come from a kind of anti-colonial perspective, so I do think it's important to acknowledge that the current mode of intimacy choreography as it's kind of entering film and TV and theater has mostly been developed in like Anglophone colonial nation states, like the one that I come from, also Australia and New Zealand, Canada. There's more uptake now in Europe. I did some research actually for this conference to see who was doing this work in Italy. I found one person who doesn't actually live here. She lives in Brussels, but I'm going to put her contact info on that shared doc that we have so that if anyone, in this region is interested in working with someone professionally, we have a contact for you. So yeah, I guess, one thing that's just really important to say is that a lot of people working in this field professionally right now are like nice white ladies with MFAs. And no shade against my friends and colleagues who are nice white ladies with MFAs, but it's something that we have been trying to attend to as the field has been developing. That's not everybody. There's a really great group in the US called Intimacy Choreographers of Color, ICOC. A woman named Ann James is sort of on the forefront of that. And there's another person who I work with, some named Kaya Dunn, who's also really focusing on the intersections of race, ethnicity, particularly blackness, and intimacy. There's obviously specific concerns. Myself, I have been focusing on some of the intersections between intimacy choreography and queer and trans sexualities, and ways that those kinds of stories can be told on stage in ways that are full of care and, hopefully healing. It is getting more global right now. I'm actually teaching, there's a German study group that I have been working with a bit. I'm also in conversation with a woman who says she's the first intimacy choreographer in India. I'm really interested in how this work will change and develop as it intersects with and hopefully is deepened and changed and challenged by people of different cultures who are sort of moving into the work. So I'm trained in it, I train other people, and then I also write academically about it as a sort of friendly internal critic. So the link to some of the things I have written are already on that Google Doc if you're interested in my sort of bigger critiques. So I'm going to share some of them here with you today in the remaining time I have as I talk as slowly as humanly possible. I want to point out, I want to do some critiques, point out some sort of misconceptions or misunderstandings that I think might be circulating, and then point out some radical directions that this work could continue going in. And sort of most importantly, what I'm interested in is thinking through how some of this consent-based practice might intersect with radical experimental film, with radical documentary film, and with community-based projects. So I don't know, but I want to give you some of my thoughts, and I'd just love for this conversation to continue, not just in the Q&A, but hopefully after as well. So obviously, this work is more sort of specifically tuned to narrative fictional settings where actors play characters. But I do think it's really important for us to think about what consent-based practice means in documentaries and experimental films, especially considering those mediums' historical complicity with sexual exploitation, right? And I'm thinking about Robert Flaherty and just all of the early documentarians whose crimes still cannot be measured. We live in a filmic world that has been based on the exploitation of women, and particularly women of color. So it's our job to keep changing that and pushing that forward and to not sweep it under the rug. Okay, so some misconceptions about intimacy choreography. I just want to say that from most people I know who are working on it, it's not a sex negative thing, and it's not a sex cop thing. I think there's a little bit of an idea that those people are now here as a sort of HR representative trying to make sure that no one's, going to get sued. The people that I know are not thinking of it that way. Most people I know, and honestly, a lot of the pushback that I see calling it sex negative comes from people, I'm sorry, but white men of a certain age who became adults and artists in the 1960s art scene and see some of media's radicality as connected to their own personal unconscious and libidinal energies and are not willing to let that go. And I just want to say you can let that go. You can let that go. There's a lot of ways to be free. And expressing your sexuality to other people does not have to be one of them, right? So I see a lot of my fellow intimacy choreographers thinking of this work as activist work, a way to push back at gendered and racialized norms of media making, and a way to change the culture more broadly. That said, as it is interfacing with these multinational mass media and entertainment conglomerates like HBO, it's already getting watered down, already, in a couple of years. I already feel like it's less radical and more HR-oriented than it was 3 years ago. There's a little bit of a gold rush in the field right now. People are really excited about this job. sex, celebrities, film, it has everything fun. So there's a big rush to licensure. Now you would think that licensing people for this work makes sense. You don't want people to screw it up. But the question is, this field just emerged. Who's licensing the licensors? And how much money does it cost to take a class to get a license? And how is that gatekeeping and extending the reach of specifically white people? And in a lot of ways, white women. White women from a background that can afford them to take a licensing class so that they can be the one to teach Roger Jean how to, kiss someone on Bridgerton. So it's my personal mission to keep pushing the radical agenda of this. I believe it comes out of a long history of radical politic, which I don't have time to tell you about now. I'm going to do some hot tips from it. And that I think it should stay tied to that kind of radical queer history as it moves forward. So in the shortest possible way to give you this, I think that there's a queer and grassroots history of the contemporary consent activist movement that traces pretty directly to ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, the term safe sex, which we've now changed to safer sex, which I think also now connects to safe spaces, which was a term that queers made up before it got watered down, and then we had to change it to brave spaces. So safe sex was coined in 1992 in a collaboration between 3 gay activists, one of whom was a doctor, 2 of whom were HIV positive, one of whom was a hustler, former sex worker. There's a great documentary about this called Sex Positive. But this term safe sex really introduced the idea of formal pre-sex conversations. I know this seems simple, but it was a big deal, this concept of safe sex. Now, of course, before and alongside that, I argue that a lot of the main innovators in structured communication around sex have always been sex workers and people who are structurally sexually predated, like Black women and Indigenous women forced by circumstance to be innovators on consent and how to get their consent respected. Of course, there's not a lot of written record about this innovation. Also, kink practitioners have been working through concepts of consent since time immemorial. The history of kink is very interesting. Some argue these practices date back to about the time that writing was invented in Mesopotamia. In the Kama Sutra, they talk about consent practices and how to make sure that if you're doing any kind of impact play, that you have the consent. So consent's not new, and it's not white, right? It has always been innovated on by women and people who've been predated. Some contemporary BDSM culture, so that sort of emerged from soldiers coming back from World War II, motorcycle gangs that became sort of gay leather motorcycle gangs. They invented this term safe word. The safe word is we can do whatever we want until someone says stop, until someone, pulls back their consent. So, there's more about the history of consent discourse in the United States. There's a lot of anti-rape movement in the 1970s. And then that movement also gives a historical nod to a really terrible incident that happened in the city that I'm from, Memphis. There was this racialized violence called the Memphis Massacre in 1866 during U.S. Reconstruction. And that actually functioned as some of the first federal testimonies of rape. So this is 1866. This was the sort of early Me Too movement where women who'd been sexually violated in this massacre had to report what had happened, to the government. But so consent discourse also then entered through sex ed into sort of circulation. I don't know, another SNL, another consent moment in SNL. People heard of Antioch College? Antioch College was the first to establish what is now called affirmative consent as a protocol at their college. So in 1991, they said, sex can't happen on our campus unless you have affirmative consent. It was so crazy at the time. It was such a crazy idea that SNL did this whole skit making fun of how this is 1991. I was a kid. They did this whole sketch about how absurd it was to get affirmative consent. Now this is kind of the basis. This thing that students wrote, right? The student activists wrote this. It's now kind of the framework for sort of consent practices on college campuses, at least all over the U.S. This intimacy choreography is also in conversation with disability activism, both through the links with ACT UP and HIV activism, and also activism of survivors. And then one of the major innovators has some disabilities, and she says it has framed her ideas of care and how we care about the bodies. So basically, at a basic level, it's a form of grassroots labor organizing, often by actors, often women actors whose boundaries themselves have been crossed in professional settings and are trying to push back and make a difference. It's also an attempt to fundamentally change the industries, not just through preventing harm, but also through advocating for the inclusion of people whose boundaries and perspectives have been like disrespected for so long. So one of the biggest changes I think that is suggested in the framework of intimacy choreography is literally just to think differently about time. In another paper that I write, I argue that like the time crunch inherent to making creative media is differentially violent against different people based on their multiple marginalization. So when you get rushed, when you get stressed on your tech week or in your shoot, first people who are going to get hurt are multiply marginalized and people at the bottom of the ladder. That is what always happens. So part of intimacy choreo is just the concept, like knowing that that's the case and thinking of how to plan ahead and thinking of how to sort of avoid those kinds of time crunches. One of the principles of it that I love is this concept that Laura Reichert, one of my colleagues, describes as space to breathe. It's based on a biophysiology of stress, based on an understanding of stress as a sort of biophysical condition. And this is like what we teach preschoolers. She teaches you to literally take a space to breathe, regulate your nervous system through deep breaths, and then get back to the creative work of media making. We rarely let ourselves do that. We're so busy, we're so rushed, we're so pushed. Okay, so I know I'm out of time, but I'm gonna just go to my last two slides. I wanna show you these. We can think about them and talk about them more later. These are the 5 best practices of intimacy choreography as developed by the company that I work for, which is called Theatrical Intimacy Educators. They're pretty simple. I don't have time to say more about them, do I?
In the Q&A.
Okay, in the Q&A, maybe I'll go to my next slide because I do think some of the details are useful. Establish consent, take time to establish boundaries, have a deloaded process, choreograph it, and document it. It's pretty straightforward. I have some more sort of detailed concepts that maybe I can talk about in the Q&A. Some of these are words we use and don't use. We, for example, don't like the word triggered. We don't think it's useful in the creative setting. We have a couple terms we use instead. We also don't step in as choreographers. Sometime in dance, you'll like step in and do the thing. We don't do that in intimacy. We also don't touch the people that we're working with. Here's some other things we do under the deloaded process. We try to have a specialist, so it's not the director. The hierarchy of it being the director doing this work actually can be pretty harmful, so having a specialist do it is something we recommend. We use placeholders for kisses so that people don't have to kiss in every single trial take while they're getting the lights set up. And we try to use anatomical language, so it feels a little awkward at first, but we talk about the front and back of the pelvis instead of the groin and the ass, right? Deload the language, front and back of the chest, or front of the chest. Anyway, I can talk more about these sort of specific things. A lot of them, like I said, are specifically directed for creative, for fictional place where people are playing characters, but I think there's some connections to other forms of film, and I'd love to talk more about that later. I think that's all my time. Thank you. I appreciate getting to talk about these things with you.